It was Matthew Arnold who said, "With women, the heart argues, not the mind." Hello. This is Nelson Olmsted. In the world of literature, there's a kind of story to fit every possible mood. Humor or horror, romance or pathos. Today, I'd like to tell you a story by Carolyn Slade about a rather pathetic farm wife who wasn't appreciated. It's entitled Mrs. Sabin. Mr. Sabin finished his 14th griddle cake, pushed back his chair, and drew on a pair of heavy boots. Mrs. Sabin turned over the 15th cake on the griddle with calculated flop of experience and watched it cook. She poured herself a cup of coffee, put the griddle cake on her plate, and sat down on the edge of her chair. Mr. Sabin nodded, took his straw hat from its nail, looked at the clock, and went out the door. Mrs. Sabin immediately began to talk. "Well, nearly 6 o'clock, she observed pleasantly to the quiet room, and my head's commenced aching already." She drank her coffee quickly, poured another cup, and leaned back in her chair, sipping with a strange air of daring. "Well, I never lolled so in all my life. 2 more cows got calves on. Not much milk to see to. No churning for a week, maybe. If we eat more gravy, the butter'll last out. I could wash today, but ain't gonna. He wouldn't change his shirt this week, and I don't know as I care." She leaned back more comfortably in her chair. "Land sakes, I wonder what's coming over me." Well, Mrs. Sabin ate leisurely, and then brought out her heavy dishpan and started to wash and dry the dishes. She talked to each cup, each plate, each knife and fork. She spoke of the weather, the work in the fields, the new styles, the country fair. "I don't know as I'll get there this year," she confided to a saucer. "August is an awful hard month." For 9 years, she'd said the same thing. She sighed. "Mr. Sabin will have to get a new cake of sand soap come Saturday. He thinks he used a sight of soap, but the water's hard. I've got a good notion to say so next time. The water's hard, Mr. Sabin. That's why I've got to use so much soap." "Oh, no, I can't do that. He's a good man. Been awful good to me. If he pays for things, he ought to say about 'em." She smoothed the soft white hair with a hand that trembled. "I do wish he'd get something for this headache. Seems as if sometimes I can't stand it. I hate to bother him, but if it don't stop, I gotta have something soon." When Mr. Sabin came in at noon, his dinner was ready. He hung his hat up in a nail, poured a little water into the basin, dipped his fingers in it, and wiped off the dirt on the towel. And then he sat down and helped himself plentifully to food. And after a while he spoke. "Corn showing." "Well, now, ain't that good? Early start?" He nodded, and she ate happily, sitting on the edge of her chair, ready to anticipate his needs. And after a while, he was finished with food and pleased to become talkative. "One of the teams acting bad." "My land, which one?" "The white." "My land, that's the one you went and paid $200 for, ain't it? Is it very bad?" "Don't act none too good. I guess I'll have to send for Will if it don't get no better." A glow crept over Mrs. Sabin, for Will was her oldest and only living child. He was a veterinary, horse doctor, his mother called him. And since his marriage to a stylish city girl, he'd found a little time to visit the farm. But he was awful good to her, and she loved him very dearly in her shy way. He sent her a box of candy each Christmas and Easter, and always renewed her magazine when it ran out. Her eyes grew dim with longing. And then a quick thought, born of pain, came to her. "How you going to get Will out?"
"Well, Jim can take the mare and go after him."
"Well, could you get something for my headache?"
"Oh, aching again?"
"Something awful. Seems as if I can't stand it. Takes me sometimes in the back of the neck, so I'm not crazy with the pain of it."
"Oh, maybe it's a crick."
"Maybe so. My arms get sprickly and numb, too, like you could stick pins in me and not feel it. But my head's the worst."
Now, that's too bad. I'll tell Jim if he goes to step into the drugstore and get something. And if he don't go, I'll get it myself Saturday.
She got up from her chair, eager to show her gratitude, and brought him his pipe to smoke. She was silent, waiting for him to speak, brimming over with sympathy for the sick horse.
It acts like it had the colic, Mr. Sabin said. And again, it don't. But I feel anxious. I know it's suffering. I've given him all I know to do to try and stop his pain, but it don't help much.
The poor thing. They were silent until Jim, the hired man, came running in.
Hey, the white's worse, he yelled. He's stamping bad.
Mr. Sabin rose to his feet, all energy and briskness.
Well, then he's in pain bad. You go harness that mare right up and bring Will, and don't go slow either, Jim.
But the pigs ain't fed yet.
Well, Mr. Sabin turned to Mrs. Sabin from the doorway.
You can tend to the pigs, can't you?
Right off, she answered. Well, the men went quickly down the path, and she had a desire to call out to them not to forget her medicine. But the habits of a lifetime held, and she didn't trouble them while they were busy. She felt old now and very, very weary. She was amazed that she should be so exhausted after a morning of easy hours, and wondered greatly at herself. She took a swill bucket to the pigs and lifted the heavy pail to the trough. She walked unsteadily, her free hand finding the back of her neck again and again. And all the while, her thoughts were on the sick horse. And in some unexplainable way, it was all mixed up with herself, her evil thoughts. Suppose it died? $200, that was a sight of money. She went out to the barn, to her husband and the sick horse. The horse was worse, and he was plainly worried. She watched the poor beast until her own legs grew suddenly weak beneath her, and she was forced to lean against the rough boards for support. A curious pallor overspread her face. She said, "Did you think to tell—" The white horse made a sudden attempt to bang its head against the wall, and she shrank back, her sentence uncompleted. In all her life, she'd never suffered so much. Her body was wet with the sweat of agony, and a fierce nausea was upon her. She wondered what kind of medicine they would send her, and if it would help her right off. She went to her kitchen and set about getting supper with dragging feet. There would be 2 more to feed, and they would be hungry. At last, the sound of wheels in the road reached her, and her pain was forgotten in the moment of greeting. She told her son the horse was worse, and noted with shy tenderness his slick suit, his hat, his shiny shoes. She turned to Jim, pain and eagerness in her voice, and said, "Did you think to get the medicine from a headache, Jim?" He stared at her. "Why, you never sent for no medicine by me, Miss Sabin." He and her son turned and went out to the barn. Mrs. Sabin walked back to the kitchen and cooked the supper. Then she sat down. She must have dozed for quite a while. Without warning, her son stood beside her, laughing down at her. "Ma, I think you're half asleep. The white horse is worse. I need some hot water." She was terribly ashamed. "Oh, my lad, that's too bad. Here's the tea kettle, boiling full." Her son took it, and Mrs. Sabin said, Will, have you got anything you could give me for a headache?"
Oh, you women always have headaches. You do seem sort of peaked, though, Ma. But I haven't a thing only for horses. Maybe it's your stomach. Taking any baking soda?
"Lots."
Then try taking a dose of castor oil when you go to bed. I gotta hurry now. Pa's pretty well upset.
After he'd gone, Mrs. Sabin dozed again. She had a lovely dream. She walked in such a beautiful green field, and the flowers were so fragrant, and she had time to stoop and smell of them. She had no feeling of weariness, no sense of being tired. She was full of happiness and joy and anticipation. She walked slowly, sensing that some miracle was about to happen. And then Jim came in for supper, saying that the horse was better. And with the dream upon her, Mrs. Sabin dished up the meal. The pain in her head grew worse, and she became angry, suddenly very full of bitter thoughts. "Don't no one care about my head? Where's my headache medicine I sent for? Where is it?" Jim peeled an egg and dipped it into the salt. She realized in some way that she had not voiced the words, had not given them sound. She laughed, her anger leaving. She poured more coffee for Jim. He ate placidly, finished, and then went out. Mrs. Sabin went back to her chair by the stove, dreadfully weak and shaky. Mr. Sabin and Will came in for their supper, talking about the business in hand. Mrs. Sabin attended to their wants, waiting upon them silently. When they were satisfied, she sat down in the chair by the stove and was very quiet. Mr. Sabin turned to her in surprise.
Ain't you going to eat your supper?
But I don't feel as if I could swallow a thing.
There, now, if I didn't go and forget that medicine. Now, that's a shame. Will, can't you send something back for Jim tonight?
Well, sure I can, Will answered. Rose has some pills that just hit the nail every time. Takes one every hour. But I'd say a dose of castor oil wouldn't hurt none. Her color's bad. You take a dose, Ma, and I think it should adjust your stomach.
And don't you worry about that horse, Ma. That horse is all right. You go to sleep and sleep that headache off. I feel awful not getting your medicine. I clean forgot it. That horse had me worried.
She turned her face to him and smiled. And as she did so, his huge bull-like head was thrust forward, and an alien look, something like a struggling, baffled breath, passed over his face.
Ma, you ought to speak up. You ought to say, you know how I feel awful. You never speak up.
Her own voice was eager as she answered him. Why, Mr. Sabin. Mr. Sabin. For one tiny second, some tiny bit of something eternal passed between them. Unrecognized, but dimly felt. And then Mr. Sabin lumbered to his feet, took his head off the nail, went out the door. Mrs. Sabin got out her heavy dishpan and did her dishes. She didn't talk tonight. She felt a great, overwhelming sense of gratitude for all things, that she would soon be asleep, that Mr. Sabin was so sorry, that Will was such a good boy, that she was to have some pills for the easing of her pain. She sat down for a moment to think it all over, her feet resting upon the hot hardness of the stove, and she dozed. And she found again the same pleasant place, the same fragrant flowers, the same freedom from weariness. Sometime later, Mr. Sabin and his son came to the doorway. Will glanced into the room and said,
Well, Ma's gone to bed, and that's the place for her. Her headache will be gone by morning.
Well, I'll be going. Horse ought to be pretty good tomorrow. But I go easy in working of him. Pain like that takes a horse's strength clean away. Better let him rest a while.
That's dead right, Will. That won't do him a mite of harm to lay off for a day or two. That team's been working hard now all spring. Yes, Will, I'll rest him up.
Easy on the food.
I know.
Well, then, good night for now.
Good night.
Mr. Sabin watched his son drive down the road and thought proudly, he's a good horse, Doctor. None better in these parts. He stood a second longer, considering the weather, then turned to the kitchen, thinking to have his customary nap before going to bed. He went to the chair by the stove, a yawn opening wide his mouth. He stumbled against something. Mrs. Sabin lay upon the floor, very quiet, as was her way. Very quiet and silent and still. Her eyes stared up at him. Her mouth seemed twisted and strange. He stooped and lifted her and suddenly held her close to him. Dimly, haltingly, he bent his head and kissed her. Ma, he said. Ma, do you hear me?
You have just heard Carolyn Slade's short story, Mrs. Sabin, as told by Nelson Olmsted. And now a closing word.
Well, this story by Carolyn Slade was written about 20 years ago. We've enjoyed having you with us this morning. This is Nelson Olmsted saying goodbye and good reading.
Nelson Olmsted has presented another great short story from the world of literature. This is NBC, the National Broadcasting Company.